That's savage. Bring her to me! They've seen us.
Then we finish what they started.
Silver Creek, New Mexico Territory. Il 3 novembre 1883. She stepped into the line of fire before the sheriff could blink one heartbeat, one gunshot, and everything changed. The wind cut like iron filings. It came off the high desert and through Silver Creek as if the town were nothing but a cracked flute for it to whistle through. Nails hissed in warped boards. A loose sign chain ticked the post like a pocket watch that had forgotten whose time it kept. I stood knee-deep in the ordinary, checking a fence rail that had been gnawed by sun and season, my mind narrowed to the small, stupid comfort of a man's hands doing a job he could finish. There are worse prayers than work. You can say them without anyone hearing. You can say them with splinters. I am Ethan Grant, once a soldier, then a lawman, now a sheriff with a rope-burned badge, and too much silence living between my ribs. Dawn had started clean and brittle. My first sound wasn't bird or horse, but the wire's thin music as I pulled it taut, like stretching a truth until it sang. I counted staples. I counted knots. Counting keeps a man from counting ghosts. Something shifted on the land. Not a breeze, not a cow. Something that didn't belong to the land. I didn't look up right away. You learn to listen with your skin first. The dust changed its mind, slanting farther east, as if the ground itself had sucked a breath and held it, a hitch in the world's chest. That was when the thunder began, not from sky, but from town. Boots, hollers, a single hammer click, that every man on the frontier knows the way a sailor knows waves. My knuckles tightened on the fence post. Habit had my hand check the colt on my hip before my eyes bothered to lift. I lifted them slow, like a man raising a headstone he'd carved himself. Silver Creek's main street was a long, narrow mouth. This morning it was full of teeth. A crowd gathered in the rib of daylight between the general store and the saloon, bodies pushing closer, the town's courage always braver in a herd. Above them, the noose on the gallows beam moved just enough to blink at the Sunday. It wasn't gallows day. It wasn't any day that ought to have rope in it. But the West had a way of adding rope to days you thought were already full. I started walking. Fence job forgotten. A man doesn't ignore thunder, even when it's made of people. The sound clarified as I got closer. Not a duel, not a drunken brawl. This had ceremony in it. Ceremony is what cowards use to make evil look tidy. I stepped between wagons, past a mule flicking at invisible flies, past a woman clutching a paper parcel to her chest as if it might learn to breathe if she held it tight enough. I saw the noose clearly then. I saw the post they'd rigged like a joke altar. And I saw the man they meant it for. He wore my star. They had me on display, or a version of me. My office door ripped off and thrown like firewood, my desk papers scattered, my hat on a stray dog's head while boys jeered. I say me because a sheriff is as much symbol as flesh, and what they'd trust to that pole was not only a man but an idea. My wrists were cinched behind the post, my badge still pinned like a coin to a corpse. A half-dozen of Viper Galloway's boys formed a careless ring, rifles easy in their hands, mouths loose with confidence. The kind of confidence a man gets from thinking he stands behind someone meaner. Viper stood 10 paces off, looking at me as if I were an old horse he'd once wanted and then forgot about. Scar from eye to jaw, smile like a cracked plate. He had the calm of a man who'd never bent to pick up the thing he broke. Around us, Silver Creek watched with the hungry quiet of people who had learned that hope was an expensive habit. "You're late to your own hanging, Sheriff," Viper called, "but I reckon we can start without your permission." A boy could have thought he was funny. A boy could have laughed. The town didn't. They didn't laugh. They didn't spit. They didn't move. When men have watched enough bad miracles, they stop performing surprise. I steadied my breathing. Not because I wasn't afraid. Fear is a practical thing, a match you strike when you need to see. I steadied it because my hands weren't free, and because anger is thirst, and the desert always wins against the thirsty. Law says rope waits on a judge, I said. You ain't the judge of this place. I am today. He turned to the crowd. This town has been bleeding itself to keep an old world alive. Sheriff Grant here, he's a splint on a rotten bone. I mean to set it right. I could taste the dust on my tongue. Metal and grit. Men cheered for him in their throats, but let it die in their mouths. That's how fear talks. Half sound, half life. Then the world cracked. A single report tore the air, clean as a blade through paper, not one of Viper's guns. The shot struck dirt between two of his men, warning, not kill. Echo bounced along the clapboard fronts, rolled off the feed store, settled into the crowd as a question. I tried to track the angle by ear. Roofline, east side. Near the general store chimney, someone with a steady heart and a better reason than most. Find him, Viper snapped. Drag him down. Two of his men peeled off, rifles high, heads tilted, eyes running the gutter lines and windows. A woman near me flinched and crossed herself. She wasn't praying for me. She was praying for whoever had the nerve to poke the snake. Another shot. This one clipped the saloon sign, sent splinters of painted wood pinwheeling into the street. It didn't feel like random bravery. It felt like someone asking for a trade. I turned my head, slow, the way you'd turn if you heard your name in a dead man's mouth. Movement flitted along the general store roofline shadow to chimney, to the low parapet above the apothecary. A figure, slight and sure. Long dark hair blown like a pennant. She ducked, reappeared, rolled, fired again, not to kill but to herd. Apache. The word struck my chest and then went lower, to the place that still believed in debts. Out here, folks used the word like a weather, something that came when it came and did what it wished. But I'd learned better once. I'd learned that Apache wasn't storm or legend, but people with names and mothers, people the desert held like memory. I'd also learned I was capable of failing them. Viper's sneer turned from me to the roofs. That's savage, he hissed. Bring her to me. The men obeyed. Cowards usually do, when someone meaner gives them direction. I flexed my wrists against the rope. It burned. The post didn't give. My badge flashed the sun into my eye, and I took the flinch like a slap useful. Pain tells you where you still live. That's when I felt the small movement by my hip. A hand, small as a sparrow, slid a knife into my palm. I didn't look down. Looking down is confession. The boy who'd pressed it was already gone, melting into skirts and dust and chance. Knife edge found rope. I sawed slow, as if my pulse were the blade. Above us a door banged and two of Viper's men fired wild across the roofline, enough splinters to seed a second town. The figure on the roof didn't answer. She'd disappeared. Hold, Viper barked. Air stretched thin as a drumskin. Rope parted. I didn't bolt. A man running looks like guilt and invites bullets. I let my legs go slack as if I'd fainted from too much ceremony, slid my shoulders, twisted the loosened loop, and stepped clear of the post. The ring of men around me didn't see. They were staring up. Snakes forget ground when they smell a bird. I moved left. A man shouldn't have been able to in that circle. But I've learned that evil always leaves gaps, pride carves, doorways in it. The gap was a drunk with his rifle lagging. I went through like I was born for that space and came up beside the hitch rail with both lungs still mine. I took the boy's knife, flipped it in my hand, and hid it along my forearm. The roofline shifted again, a flash of leather. The girl, woman, whoever she was, dove from the general store roof to the lower awning of the apothecary, caught the beam with both hands, swung, and dropped to the alley. She landed wrong, the kind of wrong that writes pain in a person's gait for a week. Her hand went to her side and came away red. East Alley, one of Viper's men howled, as proud of his noticing as if he'd invented eyes. 3 of them bolted after her. Viper's gaze followed, but he didn't move. He watched me. We looked at each other across the foot of dust. The crowd had left empty between us. He saw that I was no longer attached to his theater. I saw that he had not yet decided to be impressed. Run, lawman, he said, almost bored. It's prettier when they run. Oh? The knife sat cold against my wrist. The street sat hot around my boots. Somewhere behind the stable, a horse blew its breath like a bellows, hungry for the road. I could have gone. I could have taken the alley west, cut behind the livery, and made the ridge by sundown. It would have been the practical thing. Survival has a good argument in this country, but the wind cut like iron filings, and there was a woman in the alley who had traded her safety for my breath. A man's honor is a piece of leather. It's only strong if you keep working it. I moved. I didn't go at Viper. Men like him are quick with pride and quicker with lead. I went at the gap his men had left going east. The crowd parted the way wheat parts when a reaper knows his work. I slipped through bodies, smell of lye soap and fear and last night's whiskey, past a girl losing her ribbon, past a preacher pressing 2 fingers to a book whose words were too tired to climb out. The alley mouth was a coin of shade. I took it. Silver Creek kept its alleys for heat and bad choices. I went soft-footed past stacked crates and a window with its curtains, pretending not to know what eyes could be for. A smear of blood marked the packed dirt in half-moons, left by a hand that didn't have time to be careful. I followed them into the second cut, then another. The map of a town's shame curled behind the facades. It showed daylight. Then she was there. She had pressed herself into the kink where the apothecary's foundation met an old adobe wall. Her hair was stuck to her cheek. Her dress, doskin worked and worn, was dark at the side. She held a rifle that wasn't hers, mine by the look of it, the nick in the stock where I'd slammed a door on it 3 years back. Her hands were steady on the wood. Her eyes were the color of dark water when wind walks across it. Up close, things get simpler. "Leave the street," I said. My voice was low to keep it from breaking. "You head for the arroyo behind the livery. There's a mesquite break. I'll bring horses." Her mouth tightened. Doubt or pain, I couldn't tell. She didn't ask who I was. She knew the badge and the rope told the story well enough. She looked past my shoulder. They came into the alley at a half-run. 3 of them, not thinking about crossfire because men like that don't think. They just aim. First one lifted his barrel. I didn't think either. I stepped, grabbed the muzzle with my left hand, drove it up and to the side, and let the boy's small knife introduce itself to the soft piece of skin below a man's jaw where stubble grows obstinate. He dropped like a notion that had learned manners. Second one fired. The round sang splinters off the wall by my head. The woman fired once clean, no flourish. The man spun back against the crates, mouth surprised to find it had swallowed red. The third was too close for her to risk me. He swung the stock like a club. It found my cheekbone and turned my thoughts to light. I went to one knee, saw boots, felt the gun butt rising for a second sermon. I hit low knee joint, then stomach, then throat, fighting the way men fight who got tired of dying in other men's memories. He went still, not dead, just introduced to quiet. Smoke hung like a thin ghost. We didn't look at the bodies long enough to make them names. I took the rifle from her hands and pushed it back into her arms. "Arroyo," I said. She nodded. The angle of her mouth accepted orders the way the land accepts rain, without promise, without apology. She started, stumbled, caught herself with a hand to the wall. The blood at her side was too much for the walk I was asking of her. I moved to take her weight without touching more than I had to. Men forget that touch is a kind of language. Out here, it's a tongue that can get you killed if you speak it wrong. She didn't flinch when my arm went around her back. She didn't lean, either. We went like that, balanced by pride and necessity to the alley's bend. The back of the livery smelled of oat dust and old iron. 2 ponies, Navajo mounts by their look, small and honest, were tied off in shade. I glanced at her. She shook her head once. Not hers, but they'd carry. We didn't take saddles. Time is a horse thief. I cut leads, looped a bridle, and set her up on the darker of the pair. She moved like she'd been born to a bare back and a long road. I swung onto the other and kept to the mud of the arroyo where sign sinks and wind doesn't brag about you. Behind us, the town didn't erupt. It swallowed. That's worse. It meant Viper was thinking. Men like him are dangerous when they remember they have a skull. We rode south into the heat, the way a prayer rides into a throat. She didn't speak for a mile. I didn't ask. When she did, her voice was smoke-thin but steady. "My name is Aiyana," she said. "Of the Bedon Kohei." I knew the name. I knew more than I wished about who had been driven where and why, and what men like me had been told to call it. I let the syllables sit in my mouth carefully, like a ring I had no right to wear. Anya. She turned her face away so I couldn't read it. That's a woman's right. A man should learn which truths he has to earn. We rode until the sun found its meanest hour. The desert has a way of bending a man's thoughts into the shape of thirst. The earth lay out like hammered copper. Heat ghosts walked where road should have been. I watched her seat. Strong. She rode like she believed in land even when it was trying to kill her. By noon, she'd begun to fold into herself. Blood darkened the side of her dress to near black. I called a halt under a trickle of mesquite that had mistaken itself for a tree. I was careful about how I helped her down. Pride is a bone. You don't break it and expect a person to run later. I slid to a knee in the dust. May I? She looked at my hands, not my eyes, and then gave the smallest nod. I cut the laces at her side and peeled the leather enough to see. The wound wasn't a hole. It was a furrow, a crease left by a bullet that had missed her heart because wind once in its life had chosen mercy. It bled like it meant to get its way if we didn't argue back. From my coat I took a small roll linen, needle, liquor that had once been for forgetting. I poured the liquor. She didn't make a sound. That told me more about her than all the words a quiet day could hold. I stitched. Hands remember the things they regret. Mine remembered more than their share. When I was done, I wrapped her tight and pressed my palm over the bandage to hold the heat of me there. She watched me the way a hawk watches distance, as if the space between us were something alive. Why? She asked. There are questions a man can say too much to. I gave her the only coin I own, because a person doesn't leave another to the rope when he still has two legs. She blinked once, then again like a rider measuring horizon. She didn't thank me. I didn't earn it yet. We drank water in silence. The ponies cropped at nothing. Wind lifted the heat and set it down again. A fly found the cut on my knuckle and reminded me that the world prefers its debts paid. I closed my canteen. Viper won't make the same mistake twice. He'll track. He'll hunt sign like a wolf that's learned to love its own teeth. I glanced at the long run of desert climbing away to the red country. You know this land better than I do. Her mouth twitched. Everyone knows their own graveyard better than strangers. Where do we go that makes us strangers to him? She looked past me. West, where the ridges deepened and the rock began to remember being mountains. She lifted her chin toward a thread of shadow you wouldn't have seen if you didn't know what to look for. There, she said, a dry creek that learns water after dark. It leads to a cut in the wall, and beyond it, a canyon that doesn't say its name to men it doesn't trust. You trust it? She held my gaze. I am here. Trust is sometimes nothing more than a person's refusal to lie to themselves. We moved again. The afternoon drew itself into a tight fist around the sun, then unclenched into longer light. We followed the dry creek she'd promised. When I rode ahead to scout, she didn't argue. When I fell back to hear how the ground sounded under the pony's hooves, she didn't sneer at caution. Twice I saw dust to the northeast, small, uncertain, could have been cattle, could have been men. Either way, the land had learned to keep its secrets. At dusk we reached the cut. It was a mouth in the rock with lips of mesquite and a tongue that tasted like old rain. We slid off the ponies and led them through sideways, bodies close to the stone so our shadows would be harder to swear to. The world cooled. Shade is its own mercy. Inside, the passage widened to a narrow throat of red and gold stone, the kind of place light enters on its knees. She staggered once and held herself upright with a kind of fury that made my teeth ache to watch. Sit, I said. It came out rougher than I meant. Saturday, I made a small fire that didn't have ambition. Smoke kept low, as if it had secrets too. We ate what I had. Salt meat. A heel of bread the dust had already claimed. She took it without complaint. When she finished, she pulled a small bundle from a pouch at her belt leaves and torn roots wrapped in a strip of cloth that had once been a man's sleeve. She chewed some, spat the pulp into her palm, and pressed it to her side under the bandage. Yarrow, she said, horse mint, and other words you don't know in your mouth. My mouth has room. I tried to smile. Men like me forget how to make it convincing. Tell me them. She told me one. Klitschko. What does it mean? Not everything wants to be learned all at once. The corner of her mouth bent, a joke so light you could mistake it for a breath. Night gathered. Coyotes let the dark know it belonged to them. The fire throbbed like a tiny heart and gave nothing away to the sky. I sat with my back to stone, Colt across my knees, ears working the way a man's do when he wants to live. She lay on her side, not sleeping so much as listening from a different angle. After a long time she said, "He will come." "Yes. You know him. I know his kind. The West grows them like scrub hard, ugly, and patient. And you? I'm the fence post that forgot what it was for and decided to stand anyway." "Oh." She turned her head and studied me as if looking for a map I'd hidden under my skin. "You carry dead ones. Everyone does. But yours speak. They're polite. They wait their turn." Silence settled heavy between us, not hostile, just full of things neither of us had enough breath to lift. I thought of a woman's hair that had smelled of soap and of a small hand clutching the hem of a dress as flames put another word for justice on our house. Viper hadn't done that, but the kind of man he was had taught the world to make sense of it. "Sleep," I said finally. "I'll wake you when it's your turn not to." She closed her eyes without trusting the world to hold her. I kept my watch. The canyon stone kept its own. The first coyote silence is a lie. It comes before the second hour, and men new to the country think it means safety. The second coyote silence is the one that matters. It is when all the little deaths of the night take their places and wait. That's when I heard the pebble tick. Not an animal, a boot scuff. Careful, but not careful enough for stone. I touched her shoulder. She was sitting with the same quiet I was before my hand left her. I didn't ask her to trust me, and she didn't ask me to be a better man than I was. We put out the fire with dust, which is the way this land likes to be useful. I moved left along the throat of the cut, and she went right, into a dark that looked thick enough to hold her weight. I counted 3 shadows at the mouth, then a 4th, the wide, ugly patience of a man who believes he owns tomorrow. Viper's voice came soft as a lie. "Sheriff," he called, "I reckon you'll want me to say how this ends. You always liked rules." My cheek throbbed where the rifle stock had taught me humility. Rules are when a man pretends he'll be surprised by what he already knows. He chuckled. "You got a tongue on you. I'll cut it out if it keeps talking pretty." He took another step into the cut. The mouth of the canyon framed him like a portrait I didn't want on any wall. Behind him, the men kept their rifles loose and their eyes stupid. That's a dangerous combination. Stupid eyes are lazy. Lazy eyes get people killed. I looked at the stones at my feet. Some talk, some break. The one near my boot had a white seam in it. White seams are how the land admits it can't keep itself together. I hefted it once to feel its story, then set it down again. Dynamite would have been tidy. I had stone and a right hand that still remembered a throw. The world narrowed to the shape of the canyon mouth and the breath between the next 3 heartbeats. I waited for him to speak so I could know where his teeth were in the sentence. "Bring me the girl," he said. "We'll let the town see her hang proper. Then we'll give you a fairer show than the one you nearly got." The stone left my hand on the first word of fairer. It hit the wall to his right and bounced, a louder noise than a shot in that throat of rock. His men flinched the way snakes flinch when a horse's hoof lands too close. I moved. She moved. The canyon moved in the only language it had, echo and silence. I hit the first man's wrist. She took the second man's eyes with dust and a heel and the short, vicious grace of someone who had learned to keep breathing in a world that resented it. The third fired blind and hit the place where our fire had been, which is a good metaphor and an even better mistake. Viper didn't fire. He had the patience of a man who wants to shoot something specific and make it mean something it shouldn't. We fell back deeper into the narrow, step by step, turning rocks into allies and darkness into a friend coward men never want to meet sober. The fight wasn't finished. It had hardly begun. But I felt something inside me stand up that had been sitting a long time. Anya's breath, quick and thin, moved next to mine. I couldn't see her face. I didn't need to. I knew the shape of courage when it leaned against the same stone. "Still think you can live by the law," she whispered, not mocking measuring. "Law or no," I said, "a man can die with his words still in his mouth." The wind outside the canyon died back, a long inhalation, and what little moon there was laid a knife of light along the lip of rock above us. We had an hour before the night decided which of us it liked better, and for the first time since they put the rope around my badge, I didn't feel alone. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Ashes on the wind. Lightning split the night like a whip. The blast tore through the ridge and threw sparks across the rain-slick stone. Our horses bolted. I hit the ground hard, rolled, and came up with my revolver in hand. Down below, Viper's men were already scattering, torches flashing through the storm like ghostly eyes. Anya was beside me, soaked and steady, her braid plastered dark against her neck. She didn't flinch when a bullet hissed past and chewed the rock near her knee. "They've seen us," she said. "Then we finish what they started." We slid down the slope, half running, half falling. The rain turned the sand into blood-colored mud. My shoulder screamed every time I moved, but pain was a sound I'd grown used to. At the edge of the camp, we crouched behind an overturned wagon. 2 men passed close enough that I could smell their whiskey. She mouthed to count 1, 2, and I fired first. The flash burned the dark white. Her knife found the second before he could shout. When the echoes faded, the boy's voice rose from the cage. Faint, desperate. "Anya!" She froze. It was the first time I'd heard her name spoken with love, not suspicion. She started forward, but I caught her wrist. "Wait. There'll be more." I've waited 3 years. Below, Viper stepped from his tent. Even in the rain, the man looked dry like rot wrapped in silk. A scar split his jawline and ran down to the black scarf at his throat. Around him, a dozen rifles gleamed. He lifted a lantern, scanning the ridge where we hid. "Bring the cage," he barked. "Let's see what ghosts the storm dragged in tonight." 2 men hauled the boy toward the fire. Chayton's face was a smear of dirt and blood, but the defiance in his eyes was clear. When one of them struck him, Anya moved. She hit the nearest sentry like lightning strikes a tree, no warning, just ruin. Her knife flashed, her boot followed, and by the time I reached her side, 3 were down. I shot 2 more before the rest realized hell had come from the rain. Viper fired once, calm as a preacher. The shot grazed her arm. She stumbled, but didn't fall. I dragged her behind a barrel, reloaded, counted the shadows. He called out, voice cutting through the thunder. "Sheriff Thorne, that you? Thought the desert had swallowed you." "Not yet," I said, stepping into the firelight. He smiled, thin and cruel. "You always did have a taste for lost causes. I learned from you." We circled each other, guns drawn, mud sucking at our boots. Behind him, Chayton gripped the bars of the cage. His sister whispered prayers in a language older than the land. The fire crackled. Somewhere a horse screamed. "You killed soldiers," I said. "I hired soldiers. The kind who don't ask questions. Same as you once did." He wasn't wrong, and that was the hardest part. "This ends tonight." "Then?" He shrugged. "Everything ends tonight." We fired at the same breath. His bullet took my hat clean off. Mine caught his thigh. He staggered but didn't fall. The men who hadn't fled started firing wild. Sparks rained off the rocks. Anya crawled to the cage, wrenching at the lock with blood-slick fingers. When it snapped open, Chayton fell into her arms, coughing but alive. "Go!" I shouted. But she didn't. She looked at me, the kind of look that's half prayer, half farewell, and raised the boy's rifle. She covered me while I advanced. Viper limped backward toward the tent. I followed, each step a promise carved in mud. He fired again. The slug tore through my coat and buried in the post behind me. I closed the distance, grabbed his wrist, twisted until bone gave way. His gun fell. He reached for a knife. I caught his coat and slammed him into the ground. The rain hissed around us. "Why?" I demanded. He spat blood. "Because men like us don't get to start over. We only end others." He lunged, blade flashing. I turned it, drove it home. The life went out of him slow, like smoke leaving a dying fire. When I stood, my hands were shaking not from fear, but from the weight of being right for once. Anya was there, holding Chaitan close. The boy's eyes found mine. "You were the one," he said hoarsely. "At the fort," I nodded. There was no point lying to a child who'd already seen hell. "I was the one." He looked at his sister. "Then why did you save him?" Anya's gaze didn't waver. "Because if the wind remembers every promise," she said softly, "then it must also remember forgiveness. We buried Viper where he fell. No words, no marker. Just earth, rain, and the sound of wind scraping over stone. By the time dawn broke, the desert smelled of iron and rebirth. We found shelter in an abandoned mission south of Redemption, 4 walls, half a roof, and a crucifix still clinging to what was left of faith." Anya laid her brother on a cot, tending the bruises with the same herbs she'd used on me. He watched her hands like he couldn't believe they were real. When she finished, she came to sit beside me. The firelight caught the wet strands of her hair, turning them to bronze. "He will live," she said. "You will too." Her eyes lifted, tired and sharp. "You think this is living? I've seen worse versions of it." She smiled, but there was no joy in it. "You should leave before your lawmen find you. There's no badge left to follow me." "Then what keeps you here?" I looked at her hands, steady, scarred, capable of both death and mercy. Maybe I finally found something worth staying for. Outside, the storm had passed. The air smelled of sage and wet dust. Chaitan slept, his breath even. I stood, stepped to the doorway. The desert spread wide and clean under a washed sky. For the first time in years, I didn't feel hunted. Anya joined me, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "When I was a child," she said, "my mother told me the desert eats everything except songs. She said they rise on the wind and find their way home." "Then maybe that's what we are," I said. "Songs the desert forgot to swallow." She looked at me long enough for silence to mean something. Then she leaned her head against my shoulder. "No promises. Just the quiet truth of survival." 3 days later, we rode north. The boy was strong enough to hold his own reins. The sky had the color of forgiveness, pale, endless, uncertain. Every mile between us and Redemption felt like a lifetime. We passed the ruins of the outpost where we'd sheltered before. Smoke still curled from the saloon's remains in the valley below. Word would spread soon, Viper dead, justice paid in full, but I knew the territory too well to believe peace would last. The West didn't forget, it only rested between storms. At sunset, we stopped by a dry riverbed. Anya dismounted first, her movements slow but sure. She turned to me. "What will you do now?" "Ride," I said. "Find somewhere the wind doesn't know my name. Such a place doesn't exist. Then I'll make one." She studied me with that unreadable calm of hers. "You still carry the badge in your heart, even if you threw the metal away." "No. Maybe," I admitted. "But it's heavier now." She stepped closer. "That weight, keep it. It reminds you who you are." "And who are you now?" She looked east, where the light touched the mesa's gold. A sister again. A pause, and maybe something else. I wanted to ask what she meant, but the wind answered first, brushing dust across our boots. The desert doesn't like confessions, it steals them, one grain at a time. When the first stars came out, Chaitan played softly on a small drum he'd carried from the cage. The rhythm was uneven, but it carried far. It sounded like memory learning to breathe again. Anya sat beside me, eyes on the fire. "You ever think the West can forgive itself?" she asked. "No," I said. "But sometimes it lets a man try." We didn't speak after that. Words would have only weakened the truth between us. The flames sank low. The boy's music faded. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote howled the kind of sound that means everything's still alive, even if it hurts. Before sleep claimed me, I felt her hand find mine beneath the blanket. Small, cold, human. The touch of someone who'd walked through ashes and still believed in dawn. Morning came with the color of pewter. We broke camp early. As we rode, the land opened red earth, scattered brush, the long scars of wagon trails cutting through time. The world felt both emptied and full. For once, that didn't scare me. By noon, we reached a ridge overlooking the frontier road. Below, a caravan wound west, traders, settlers, dreamers, chasing the same mirage that built this country and bled it dry. I reined in my horse. You could go with them, I said. Start fresh. She shook her head. Home is not a place, Sheriff. It's a direction. And yours? Where the wind carries my brother's song. I smiled. Just barely. Then maybe we're heading the same way. Oh. We rode down to the trail, dust rising behind like ghosts that refused to stay buried. The boy's drum kept time with the hooves. Ahead, the horizon burned gold, endless as mercy. Somewhere back in redemption, a grave waited for the rain to finish its work. Somewhere in the wind, a promise still turned over, slow, patient, unforgotten. The desert remembers. And for the first time, that felt like grace. Still here? Hit the comments with a flood of 1 second, and tell us where you're watching from if you love Wild West love stories. Blood and sand. We had both been broken, and somehow, in the wreckage, we'd found each other. The morning held the hush of a church where the congregation had gone home, but the candles still remembered flame. I stepped out of the cave and let the light lay its hands on me. The valley breathed a clean, damp breath. Steam lifted off the rock like prayers too stubborn to give up. Behind me, Aiyana shifted against my coat. If I die here, she murmured, still halfway inside sleep, this is a good place to die. You won't, I said, not because I knew, but because sometimes a lie was the rope a soul needed to climb back to truth. She opened her eyes, black glass catching morning. Chaitan, we'll find him. We will, she said, simple as a vow. I walked the rim to read what the night had written. The mud was a ledger, and every hoofprint a number begging to be squared. Viper's horse had thrashed, then gone still. The rest of the men had scattered at the storm's hard hand. But scattered doesn't mean gone. Somewhere out there, the pieces of a broken snake were learning to slither without a head. I went back and brewed coffee so thin it looked like a rumor. Aiyana took the tin mug in both hands, breathed the heat, and winced when her thigh tugged against the new bandage. We ate jerky I couldn't chew enough to call kindness, shared an orange she'd kept tucked in a pouch like a memory from another world. She peeled it slow, careful, the way you treat something fragile that isn't just fruit. Help me up, she said when we were done. You should rest. She narrowed her eyes. You should stop arguing with women who saved your life. I grinned despite the ache in me and offered an arm. She rose, weight leaning into me for the heartbeat it took to find her balance. Hozho, she whispered, looking at the ring of cliffs. It means balance, but also beauty that has survived. Then we leave it as we found it. We buried what was left of Viper at the valley's edge, where a cottonwood clawed water from the ground. No marker. Just the dirt's old mouth closing over a man who had taught me too much about the cost of looking away. When we were done, I set his pistol on the grave for the sun to blister. He'd stolen enough iron from the living. Do we speak words? I asked. Aiyana listened to the wind like it might answer. The words are in the ground. We saddled the horses. My shoulder burned when I cinched the girth. A steady pain like a debt I kept paying because the figures looked better on paper that way. Aiyana's mount stood patient as a priest, nosing at her hand. She laughed once, a small sound that surprised us both, and scratched the big animal between the eyes. I didn't say we should wait another day. She didn't say she couldn't. We rode at a walk until the valley narrowed to a slit in the stone, where a man had to turn his shoulders sideways to pass. The world squeezed us, and then let us out again onto the high desert, clean as a freshly scraped plate. We took the north line, following the red seam of cliffs that run like a scar through this country. The sun dried our clothes. Our shadows kept pace, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, depending on what the day thought of us. Every few miles, we stopped, so I could check her bandage and she could pretend it didn't hurt. Near noon, we found where Chaitan had left the trail. A boy's horse prints, narrow and quick, cut off the main path and climbed the broken shelf toward Red Mesa. He'd kept his head when the world tilted. That, more than anything, gave me hope. We'll need water, I said. She nodded toward the notch where a juniper clung. There, under the roots, a seep darkened the rock and pooled in a basin carved by hands older than anyone alive. We took turns filling the canteens, careful not to muddy the water. When we'd drunk, Aiyana dipped her fingers and touched her forehead, her lips, her chest. I didn't know the words her people spoke, but I understood the shape of thanks. We were saddling up again when the wind shifted and brought a smell that didn't belong to water or sage. Tobacco. Cheap, damp, smoked hard to cover fear. I raised a hand. Anya froze, head tilted. "Riders," she whispered. "How many?" "Enough." We led the horses into a slot of shadow and waited. The first man came into view with the kind of posture you learn from running away and calling it retreat to feel better about it. His hat sat wrong. The revolver on his hip had been cleaned too recently by somebody else's hands. Behind him crawled 3 more boys, mostly, or men the world had bent early, vipers leftovers. They saw the seep and made for it like Hunger's wore spurs. 2 dismounted and fell on the water with the greed of a sin that never had to learn please. The lead man stayed mounted and stared up at the cliffs like the sky might be hiding an answer he could steal. Anya's breath ghosted my shoulder. "The one in front is called Pike," she said. "He keeps rope in his saddle and stories in his mouth. Not all are lies. How many not lies you reckon he's got left?" 2. Maybe 3. I stepped out, gun low. "Morning," I said. They spun like a flock of quail flushed wrong. Hands flew to iron. I didn't raise mine. Men shoot faster when you give them a horizon to line up on. "We're just passing through," I went on. "So are you. Let's keep the road friendly." Pike smiled the way you do when you're thinking of how a smile looks from a pine box. "Friendly's expensive," he said. "Not today," I said. "Today it's free." He studied me, then the cave dark behind my eyes. "Grant," he said, rolling the name slow like a die in a gambler's palm. "You stink of the badge even when you ain't wearing it." "The badge stinks of me." He laughed. The boys didn't. "Viper?" he asked, then watched my face to see if there was anything there worth betting big on. "Gone," I said. The laugh died. "So who we work for now?" he asked, honest as a man gets when the wind steals his breath. "Yourselves," I said. "Or no one. I don't care which." One of the boys too thin, too proud of the way his revolver hung like a grown man's spat in the dust. "He took Jimmy," he said. "Said we were weak. Said we feed the birds before winter." "And what did you say?" Anya asked, stepping out beside me, rifle at her shoulders easy. The boys stared at her the way you stare at a storm you didn't expect in summer. I didn't. "Then learn," she said, not unkind. Pike's gaze flicked between us, weighing 2 kinds of trouble. "You got the girl," he said. "You got the boy." "Riding north," I said. "If you want your skin to last past sunset, you'll take your thirst and your questions and point them south." "And if we don't?" he asked. "Then you'll be the lesson the rest learn." He thought about that long enough to make me nervous. Then he lifted his reins, nodded once, and put his horse into a clumsy trot. The others followed, not looking back because men like them don't. When they were small on the land again, Anya let the breath leave her she'd been holding since they arrived. "You could have killed them," she said. "Could have," I said. "I'm trying something new." "What's that?" "Leaving a door open." "For who?" "For the man I might want to be later." She looked at me sideways, and something like pride tugged the corner of her mouth. We rode on. The world rose under us like an old dog, trying to remember how to get comfortable. The red cliffs threw their shade across our path in long, cool hands. A hawk saw us and decided we weren't its problem. The day had the feel of a coin that had lost its weight but kept its shine. By late afternoon we found the boy. He'd put his back to a rock wall the way you'd put your back to God if he let you, trusting and mad. The horse he'd taken stood cropped short in the reins and looked at us like we were there to ruin something small it held dear. When Chayton saw his sister, whatever brave tightness he'd been holding burst. He ran to her and didn't care that her wound bit when she knelt to catch him. "I did as you said," he said into her hair. "Red cliffs, north. I didn't look back, not even when the thunder followed." "You did well," she said, kissing his forehead and leaving a clean spot the size of a thumb on his dirt. He looked at me over her shoulder. I waited to see who I would be in his eyes. Sometimes redemption wears a stranger's face in your mind, and sometimes it's just the same old one you've been stuck with since birth. "Sheriff," he said. "Not anymore." "Oh. What are you then?" "Hungry," I said. "And tired of being hunted." He laughed, a raw sound, half boy, half wolf, learning its throat. "I know a place," he said, "if it is still ours." He meant there's a lean-to of cedar under a shelf of rock. A spring made a quiet music in the corner only people who listen will hear. There were marks cut into the wall with bone tools, a record of visits written in a language the land doesn't need translated. We watered the horses, fed them, then fed ourselves what little we carried. I cooked beans that tasted like beans, which is victory enough when you've been eating loss. Chayton slept early, the kind of sleep where a boy's fist unclenches after months of holding on to nothing you can name. Anya sat with her back to the rock and her face to the fire. I cleaned a rifle and pretended not to feel watched by a knight that had seen worse men than me and better women than her and knew where we ranked. After this, I said, "Where do you go?" "Home," she said. "And where is that?" "Where my mother is buried, where the wind can find her name." I nodded. "I'll take you. You don't owe me that. I owe you everything you didn't ask for." She smiled without teeth. "Then you're learning." The moon rose like a coin some god had flipped and forgotten to catch. Coyotes spoke down in the wash, arguing about whatever coyotes argue about when men have left enough bones to make conversation interesting. I dozed and woke and dozed again to the soft rhythm of a boy's breathing that made me remember a different cabin, a different night, the sound of something I'd lost and stopped letting myself name. Dawn came the color of a bruise that has decided it will fade after all. We rode again, toward the ground Anya had pointed with her chin when I'd asked about home. We kept the cliffs on our right and the sun on our left and pretended that was a plan. Around mid-morning, we crested a rise and saw smoke where smoke didn't belong, black, fat, not the stringy thread family fires spin when they're warming bread. This was the kind that tells you somebody got tired of a building and decided to convince it to leave the world quick. Anya's jaw went hard. "Fort Stanton," she said. "Abandoned," I said. "Since the requisitions moved south." "Men don't abandon guns," she said. "They just move them behind a different wall." We rode closer, careful. The old parade ground had become a yard for uglier parades. Wagon wheels leaned like broken prayers, crates stamped with numbers instead of names. A few men moved among the detritus with a grudging efficiency, soldiers who weren't soldiers anymore, or men who liked wearing government coats because it made the pockets feel official. At the far end, a woman with a ledger spoke to a man whose hat cost more than his horse. She had the posture of someone who had found a way to live well in a ruined world and was ready to invoice God for damages. I recognized the cut of the papers on her table, bills of sale, receipts, deeds. The West was being bought one signature at a time, and there are worse gunfights than the kind you lose with ink. Chayton bristled like a cat that has never known a gentle hand. "These are the ones," he hissed. "They came with blue coats and left in coats that showed their true color." "Easy," I said, "because boys need that word more than men, and listen to it about as well." Anya's eyes had narrowed to slits. "They sold knives to the men who burned our winter store," she said. "The mark on the crates is the mark I saw. A circle within a circle with a line. Viper was only the tooth. This is the jaw." I sat there a long breath, counting what I had. One Winchester that didn't trust me, a Colt that did, a boy who wanted to be a storm, and a woman who was one. Against us stood a building, a ledger, and 5 men who believed in numbers more than bullets. "Not today," I said. Her head snapped to me. "You would walk away?" "Not walk," I said. "Remember, au fin." She stared hard enough to bruise bone. Then she looked at the boy. "We do not light a fire when our people wait in the cold," she said, the words slow, precise, ironed flat against anger. He swallowed, nodded. He'd learned a lot of grown-up things in a cage. Now he learned patience, the hardest of all. We eased back from the ridge. The world went wide again, and the fort's smoke became just another cloud you could ignore if you lied to yourself with talent. At midday we crossed a dry river where the wind had been kind and left us a little shade. There, a horse waited. No rider. Just the animal, saddle warm, reins looped over a mesquite branch. On the cantle, a brand I knew from back when men believed my name meant something, U.S. 7th. The saddlebags bulged with paper. Orders, lists, names of towns that had learned the price of being between a canyon and a banker. At the bottom lay a roll of silver dollars heavy enough to measure loyalty by. I shoved them back and tied the bag shut. Law? Anya asked. Something that pretends to be, I said. We moved out, faster now. The land shifted from flat to ribs of stone, the kind of maze you could love if you needed somewhere for your ghosts to get lost in. Toward evening we smelled wood smoke again, but this time it spoke a softer language. We crested a hill and found them. A camp like an old song, circles within circles, pots hanging from iron, a woman stirring something that made the whole world remember it was possible to be fed. Eyes turned. Hands hovered near knives and old rifles given more respect than any treaty. An old man stood, his hair white as bone ash, and lifted his palm in a gesture that could mean welcome or wait. Anya dismounted and stood very straight despite the wound and the miles, and the history that had been burned but refused to die. She spoke to the old man in her mother's language. He answered with words that sounded like wind over a ridge and hands that drew lines between stars. When they were done, he looked at me the way the land does not with hate, but with a very careful kind of memory. "You are the lawman who is not," he said in English that carried stones in it. "Yes, sir." "Len? You bring trouble. I try to bring the end of it." He considered that, then nodded like a judge whose court is the inside of a mountain. "Bring the boy," he said. Chayton slid off his horse and ran into the arms of a woman who had the same eyes as Anya, but decades older, grief tucked into the corners like photographs you keep face down. She said his name once, like a command that brought him wholly back into the world. They brought us food stew that tasted like animals that had eaten clean grass and water that had traveled far to be there. A girl of 10 set a bowl by my boot and stared until I took it, then watched me eat like a hawk watches the field after the plow goes through. I told her thank you. She didn't answer, but some of the iron in her shoulders warmed by a degree you needed a good thermometer for. When it was dark, the old man sat by our fire with the kind of patience you can't teach a young person and said, "The snake whose head you broke will grow again if we only stomp the dirt." "I know," I said. "You will go to the fort." "Yes." "You will burn paper," he said, almost smiling. "And the table it sits on." He nodded. "Bring no rope." I wasn't planning on it. He put his hand on my shoulder. In that touch was a weight and a lightness both. "A man can break a neck," he said, "but a ledger breaks a people." Anya took my hand then, there in front of everyone, and didn't drop it, even when the old women noticed and made the kind of small noises old women make when the world surprises them, but in a way that lets them sleep well. "Tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," I agreed. I slept like you do when you know what you will do and aren't proud enough to ask God to bless it. We moved before sunrise, 3 of the younger men coming with us at the old man's nod. A hunter with eyes that laughed at fear, a quiet one who walked like a cat in long grass, and a boy who had seen enough to stand as if the ground might try something stupid. Anya rode despite her wound and didn't ask permission. I didn't offer it. Chayton stayed, face set like a man twice his years, drum held quiet at his side. The fort took shape again out of the morning like a bad rumor you can almost pretend you made up. The woman with the ledger was back at her table, hat set at a tilt that said the world existed to be tilted. The man with the expensive hat was arguing with a sergeant whose mustache had known the inside of too many mugs. Horses stamped. A wagon groaned under crates that thumped like the hearts of men who had no idea their names were already written on a list they'd never read. "Window," I said, pointing. "Back wall, dry goods. If we bring the roof down on their numbers, the rest will be blind." The hunter grinned. The quiet one checked his flint like he was asking it if today was a good day to be honest. The boy swallowed and nodded hard enough to loosen something he'd been keeping too tight. Anya touched my arm. "No rope," she reminded me. "No rope," I agreed. We crawled the last 100 yards on our bellies, the dust, a second skin, the memory of last night's stew, a promise I meant to keep by living. At the wall, we split, me and Anya to the back, the others to a side door hanging limp in its hinges like a drunk trying to remember which room is his. Inside was the smell of paper and oil, and men who thought the world would always arrange itself around their chairs. I heard the woman's voice ahead, smooth and sharp. "If the territorial judge needs copies, we will provide copies," she said. If the governor's office wants percentages, we will provide percentages. That is the nature of law. It favors what shows up on time. Anya looked at me. I put one finger to my lips and 3 to the beam above. She nodded. We laid the charges like careful apologies. When we were done, we crawled back out into the honest Sunday. At the front, the hunter lit the fuse with a laugh that made my hair go up. We ran. The fort held its breath the way a man does when he's about to hear his sentence. Then the building coughed once and cleared its throat into splinters. Paper rose like a snow the desert had never asked for. The ledger flew, pages unlacing, numbers unknitting, law becoming confetti and ash. Men shouted, scrambled, grabbed at falling pages as if catching them might keep their world together. The woman stood in the doorway like a widow at a graveside, mouth tight, eyes bright with a fury that knew where it would be spending the next year. The sergeant tried to rally the workers into a line that could shoot, but we were already smoke and distance, moving in the only direction that still made sense. When we reached the ridge, I turned. "This won't stop it," I said. "No," Anya said, "but it will make it slower." 1. Sometimes slow is the difference between dying and waking up to fight again. She squeezed my hand. "You are not a lawman," she said. "Not anymore." "What am I then?" "Something the law forgot to write down," she said, and for the first time since I could remember, the answer felt better than a definition. We rode back to the camp, where laughter met us like a wall. The old man listened as I told the story and didn't interrupt to fix the parts I got wrong. When I was done, he nodded as if I had delivered a calf without tearing the cow and said, "Good." Chaitan came to me then, drum in one hand, the other held out like a man in a church line. I took it. "Stay," he said. "I can't." "Why?" "Because some men know how to build fences," I said, glancing at the posts standing like teeth along the edge of the camp, "and some men know how to ride the lines between maps." He looked at his sister, then back at me. "Will we see you?" "If the wind allows." He considered this, then smiled the kind of smile boys wear the first time they believe a story could be true, even if it isn't the one their father told. He beat the drum once, gently, as if to seal what had been said without making too much noise about it. At dusk, the sky did its old trick with fire and mercy. Anya and I stood at the edge of the camp where the land starts telling you you're foolish for believing in anything but boots and water. She put her hand on my chest, over the bone that had forgotten its job and was relearning it. "You can stay," she said, and the words were not a plea, or a test, or a trap. They were a path laid down and left alone. "If I stay," I said, "I become something that needs guarding. And you already have a brother. If you go," she said, "take this." She pressed something into my palm, a small disc of carved bone, a spiral within a spiral. "For balance," she said, "for the times you forget which way your horse is pointed." I slipped the disc into the inside pocket of my coat, where men keep letters they can't read without bleeding. "I'll bring it back." "You'd better," she said. And then she surprised me and kissed me soft and fierce, the way a woman does when she isn't saying goodbye, but isn't saying the opposite either. I saddled up. She did not watch me mount. She looked instead at the horizon like the future might be arriving on time for once. I turned the horse with my knees and set him to an easy lope. At the last rise, I glanced back. She stood there, small and unbreakable, the camp's fires painting her in gold and moving shadow. The boy beside her lifted his drum and struck it twice, like a heartbeat sent over distance. The sound reached me late, the way all the best things do. Night took the sky in its good teeth. The land opened. Somewhere behind me, a ledger burned out and became the dark. Somewhere ahead, a town I had left would pretend not to recognize me until it decided what price to put on my head. Between those two somewheres, a wind rose dry, honest, and full of names. Mine was one of them. So was hers. I touched the disc in my pocket and rode. "Hey there. Friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." Canyon of echoes. The desert stretched before me, endless and honest. Somewhere out there was redemption, not the kind you read in books or preach in churches, but the kind you earn step by step, breath by breath. I let the horse choose an easy gait until the day heated into the part where even lizards get philosophical. By noon, the wind had found its old mouth again and began to talk across the flats, carrying grit and the memory of rain. A hawk wrote a slow paragraph over the ridge, then ended the sentence with a dive I couldn't see finish. Far off, the railroad's black finger drew a line of smoke against a sky that had forgotten the storm. I kept riding west until the sun changed its mind and started falling. Toward dusk, the land softened into a shallow basin with scrub, enough for the horse to make peace with me. I made a small fire that could be mistaken for stubborn lightning and roasted rabbit over it, chewing like a man teaching his jaw patience. After, I took the old man's pouch from my coat and turned it in my hands. It smelled of earth after thunder. Inside were wrapped leaves, a twist of resin, and a powder the color of the mesa at sunrise. For wounds you can see and those you can't, he'd said. I set it close to the heat, the way a man sets faith somewhere it might work on him without his permission. Sleep came in pieces, like a fence built from boards you had lying around. Sometime in the night the wind shifted. I woke to the sound of boots on stone that wanted to be quiet and didn't know how. "Evenin', Sheriff," a voice said from the dark. "Sheriff's dead," I answered. "Pick someone else to haunt." 3 men eased into the firelight with guns held low and aim held high. Their coats still remembered the army even if their faces didn't. The tallest had stripes unstitched from a sleeve and eyes that had read orders and decided not to anymore. "You're Ethan Grant," he said. "Last time I checked. Marshall says you're wanted for arson at a federal supply." "I burn paper," I said. "If the government wants to hang paper, it can buy rope at wholesale like everybody else." That got a laugh from the youngest. The tall one didn't join him. "Marshal Doolin wants a word," he went on. "You're coming with us." "Doolin," I said. "He still carry his badge where his heart ought to be." "He still breathes law," the tall one said. "Then I ain't the one needs a doctor." They took my colt and let me keep my hat. I led my horse. They led the conversation nowhere. The town was a smear of lanterns against the night, a street with ideas above its station, a feed store, a blacksmith shed, a boarding house that had been a church in some kinder dream. The jail squatted near the end like a dog that had been beaten into loyalty. Doolin sat with his boots on a desk the town carpenters had taken too much pride in. He was square in every place a man can be square, jaw, shoulders, mind. The badge on his vest had the polish of a thing believed in. "Grant," he said, not getting up. "Hell keeps returning its mail." "Marshal," I said, "I figured you were riding the territorial circuit, late to every funeral." He tapped the desk with a pencil. "Word is you burned ledgers at Fort Stanton. Word's honest. Word is you killed a man named Viper. Word's trying to pay compliments I don't need." He chewed that, didn't swallow. "You were a lawman once." "I wore a badge," I said. "There's a difference." You going to pretend you're some kind of Robin of the Red Rocks, choosing which law to obey like a child chooses pie?" "I'm choosing which people to bury," I said. "The law can catch up later." He stared long enough the clock behind him forgot how to tick and had to start over. "You're no use to me in a cell," he said finally. "You're a wildfire. Sometimes I need one of those, if the hills are already burning." He leaned back, the chair complaining with old wood. "There's a stage coming in tomorrow, 2 women and a boy on it. I have reason to think they're being moved under guard, but not for their safety. Some damn scheme tied to land and signatures and men who love the law for how well it hides their teeth. You want me to play escort. I want you to play absolution," he said. "You take them off that coach without spilling half the county. I let your paper fire pass for now. You shoot up my street like you shot up my record last year. I teach you about consequences." I could have told him I wasn't in the teaching business anymore. I could have told him I'd already learned. Instead, I nodded. "Where's the coach?" I asked. He slid a map toward me with a fingernail. "Canyon of Echoes," he said. "Bridge washed last spring. Trail narrows enough a man can hear his own guilt. They'll slow there." "Who's the guard?" He grimaced. "Men with receipts." Then I'll return their merchandise," I said. Doolin's mouth twitched around the idea of a smile. "You leave before dawn," he said. If you don't come back with them, you don't come back. I slept on the jail's bench with my hat over my eyes and his threat under my battered conscience. Before light, the deputy shoved coffee at me and pretended to be sorry. I saddled, checked the rifle that liked me fine, and rode out while the town yawned itself awake. The Canyon of Echoes earned its name by repeating every foolish thing men had shouted inside it times, "Hold, fire." I didn't mean it. Asterisk until the rocks got bored and let the words fall. The wash cut deep and clean, its walls polished by time and arrogance. The bone-gray bridge had been replaced with logs chained like sinners to penance. I got there an hour before the stage. Wind carried the far rattle of harness iron and the closer whisper of things that could go wrong. I set myself on a ledge above the pinch where the trail narrows to a throat. From there, a man could cough and start a war. The coach came in a billow of dust and impatience. 4 horses pulled like they were embarrassed to be seen with the job. 2 riders flanked coats too fine, guns too new. The driver had the shoulders of a man who'd been freezing and sweating his entire life. I glassed the coach. In the window, a woman's face, young, freckled, eyes hard from being softer too long. Beside her, another, older, with a scar that had tried to cut beauty out and failed. A boy sat between them, skinny and coiled, the kind of child who learns to count exits before numbers. I whistled once, quick and low. The driver reined in, surprised. The rider's hands moved toward iron the way a snake's head moves toward heat. I stood where they could see me, rifle across my forearms like I was contemplating backsliding. "Road's out," I said. "Bridge looks in," the driver said. "Looks ain't always truth," I said. "Weight might shake loose what water left hollow." The nearer guard squinted. "Who are you to tell us where the ground ends?" "Someone who's buried men that thought it ended later." "Move aside," he said. "We're on a schedule." "Whose?" I asked. He didn't answer. That was answer enough. I stepped to the lip and fired into the logwork where the chain met the far stanchion. Sparks jumped, iron sang, wood groaned like an old man standing too fast. The guards flinched, which told me they were still human. "Take the women and boy out," I said. "Walk them across, one at a time." The nearer guard laughed then, a high sound that sounded like someone else had told the joke inside him. "We got papers say who they ride with." "The rocks don't read," I said. "Your papers won't help if you go down together in a mess of wet splinters. Move." The driver looked at the chain with the eye of a man who'd seen metal keep promises worse than marriages. "Do as he says," he told the guards. "I ain't losing a team to prove a point." They didn't like it. They liked it anyway. The older woman came first, skirts hitched, jaw set like a hinge in good repair. She stepped across the logs one by one, toe to heel, as if she'd been practicing for this on a parlor floor. When she reached me, I offered a hand. She glanced at it like a loaded die and took it anyway. "Ma'am," I said. "Sir," she said. The scar tugged when she tried to smile and changed her mind. The boy next, eyes darting, hand on the doorframe until he had to let go. He started, froze, started. "Count," I said. "Don't look down. Give your feet numbers. Feet like numbers." "I ain't scared," he said. "Good," I said. "Count anyway." He did. At 10 he made the last jump and stood too tall, not looking back at the distance he'd beaten. The younger woman stayed where she was, spine straight. The nearer guard leaned to speak soft to her. She didn't answer. She looked at me instead, and I saw then the steel under the freckles. It wasn't the kind they sold in towns. "You going to tell me I'm safer with you?" she asked. "No," I said. "You're safer with your decisions." She nodded once and stepped out. Halfway, a log shifted. She crouched, kept balance, waited for the bridge to finish deciding its story. Then she came on. When she took my hand at the end, it was cool and dry. She didn't let go right away. "What's your name?" she asked. "Grant." "Mine's Liza Monroe," she said. "This is my Aunt Helen. That boy is Daniel. Not mine. Not anybody's now, I reckon. We were on our way to a ranch that exists on paper and the inside of a liar's mouth." "You're off that road," I said. Behind her, the guards climbed down tight-lipped, hands out for the logs like the wood might owe them favors. When the second had both boots on dirt, I shot the chain again. It held out of stubbornness. then remembered physics and gave. The last span dropped into the wash with a splash and a curse. "What now?" the driver asked. "Now you turn around," I said. "Tell whoever put you in harness that the canyon said no." The guards looked like men calculating whether pride weighs more than bullets. I kept the rifle where they could see it, and grace where I could pretend it would cover us. After a moment, the driver took the decision out of the air. "Come on," he said, flicking the reins, pleading with the math. "Bridge ain't there no more. We ain't either." They went. Their dust hung for a while, then found ground. Liza studied me. "You set that up," she said. I encouraged nature to hurry. "You always make a habit of interfering with schedules," Helen asked. "When schedules involve cages," I said. "Yes." Daniel never blinked. "You law?" he asked. "No," I said, "but I remember how to spell it." "That makes you dangerous," Liza said. She said it like a compliment she wasn't sure I deserved. "We're going to a place where your names don't belong to paper," I said. "You'll have a say there." "What place is that?" Helen asked. "A canyon that echoes," I said, "but it repeats the right words." We rode slow, letting the world discover we weren't enemies. Daniel talked without moving his mouth, the way boys do when breath is a currency they spend careful. He'd been sent west with 2 stamps and a lie. The man meant to buy him a use, not a future. Liza had picked him out of the lie and stood next to him till the man changed tactics, not heart. Helen had left Boston after politer betrayals and wore her scar like a law against further argument. As the day leaned toward dusk, the wind found a cooler pocket under the cliffs. I felt the pull of Hozho Valley like a rope I'd tied to myself without noticing. The place where balance grew like weeds after rain. The place where Aiyana had told me ghosts didn't have to haunt if you let them help with the cooking. We reached the ridge above the camp with the sun bruising into purple. Smoke rose in polite threads. The sound of a drum came soft Chaitin, practicing. When we rode down, eyes turned and didn't harden. That was new. The old man stood where he always stood, which was wherever he decided the world's hinge had been installed. Aiyana was at his side. The sight of her hit something under my ribs I hadn't named because men don't. She came forward, walking without a limp, the line of her jaw set in welcome and warning. I swung down and touched my hat, foolish and honest. "Brought company," I said. Her eyes flicked from me to Liza, to Helen, to the boy. Her gaze softened when it fell on Daniel, the way women's eyes soften for children and wolves they believe might be saved. "You are safe," she told them. "You are seen." This. Liza's breath left her like she'd been holding it since the train. Helen's hand trembled once, then went still. Daniel looked around like he had arrived at the house of a story he'd only been told at night. The old man touched Liza's shoulder the way you touch a skittish horse firm, respectful. He touched Helen's scar with a finger that carried medicine. He crouched to Daniel's height and spoke a word I didn't know but wanted to. That night the camp made room the way the desert does without fuss, and with the understanding that tomorrow owes nobody a thing. Pots shifted, blankets shared. Laughter cut through the day's last hard edges and left them manageable. I sat by the fire with Aiyana and watched Daniel fall asleep mid-bite, a piece of fry bread in his hand like a flag won by accident. "You went looking for trouble," she said. "Trouble and I arranged a meeting." "Oh." She leaned her head just enough. The firelight made a bronze river down her braid. "You brought people," she said. "Doolin pushed me toward them," I said. "Law helped." Law looked the other way and called it strategy. She smiled without mockery. "Even the wind can be useful if it stops long enough to listen." I told her about the bridge, the guards, the canyon arguing with gravity until it won our case. She told me about the days I'd been gone, how Chaitin had learned a song that kept rain away from stitches, how Pike and his boys had come through the far wash and left their rifles at the edge of camp, how the old man had measured the distance between anger and wisdom and asked her to choose each morning. We fell quiet. The fire talked in its crackle language. Somewhere beyond the cottonwoods, an owl asked its impossible questions and was satisfied with the silence. "I meant to leave," I said softly. "I know," she said, not turning. "I went anyway," I said. "I know that too. What do you think of me for it?" She considered, the way a canyon considers whether to keep a word. "That you are learning to aim without shooting," she said. Sometimes that is harder. The next days were work. Liza and Helen learned the rhythm of grinding corn, the grace in carrying water without spilling more than your story. Liza's hands blistered, then toughened. Helen's scar lost some of its anger and became simply a mark left by time, which is all scars ever want if you let them. Daniel followed Chayton from morning to night, 2 comets trying out orbits. They ran the ridges, learned the names of plants polite enough to heal, learned the jokes crows tell. In the evenings they drummed small rhythms while the elders braided larger ones around them. If a boy has a beat under his hand, he is less likely to keep one in his fist. That's a kind of arithmetic no school teaches. Pike came on the 3rd morning, hat in hand and shame in the other. His 2 boys with him stood back like men do when they have watched something inside them change, and are afraid if they touch it, it will fly away. The old man listened to what Pike didn't say. He let them leave their guns, then sit near the edge of the circle where learning happens even if you pretend you aren't. That afternoon, Doolin arrived with 3 deputies who looked at the ground as if justice might sprout from it under the right weather. He stopped at the invisible line men feel when they are outnumbered by a thing they don't understand, and removed his hat. The old man regarded him as one regards an instrument. Useful if you remember who is playing. "Marshal," I said. "Grant," he said. He saw Liza and the others safe, and let the relief show as a microscopic concession. Then he saw Anya, and put the hat back on, as if to contain his hair and his opinions both. "This where your wind's been blowing you. For now." He cleared his throat with a sound like a nail deciding whether it wants to be a nail today. "I came to say, there'll be writers looking to make a story out of you. Fort's friends have friends. The ledger woman is already sewing a new book from whatever pages didn't burn. If you plan to stand here, plan to stand long." "We plan to live," the old man said. His English tasted of stone and old water. "Sometimes those are the same plan." Doolin nodded, slow. "I can't promise you law," he said, glancing at me. "Not the kind you want, but I can promise I won't be the rope, and sometimes I can be the knife." The old man's eyes creased in something that might, at a great distance, be mistaken for humor. "Knives cut both ways," he said. "Reckon I'll be careful," Doolin said. He looked at me. "You owe me a bridge," he added. "I owe you a ledger that told the truth," I said. "Ain't no such thing," he said. "But you can keep trying." He touched the brim to Anya. "Ma'am." She inclined her head like a queen who'd once slept on the ground and remembered why that was better. He rode out, deputies in his dust. Life sorted itself into a kind of order the land approved of. Work in the morning, work in the afternoon, music at night, and, if you were wise, love somewhere between. I found myself sleeping near the rock shelf where Anya had first handed me water. Some nights, we talked until talk did what it does and turned into breathing together. Some nights we didn't talk at all, and that said more. The canyon of echoes tested us soon enough. A rider came hard from the south with his horse's lungs on fire and his mouth not far behind. "Wagon," he panted. "Women, 2, no, 3, taken at knife point from a ranch yonder, headed for the old mine road. Saw men with black scarves. Saw a mark like a circle with a line. That mark you burned." Anya was already standing. So was I. The old man nodded once, as if he'd been expecting this sentence since before my father learned my name. "Go," he said. "Bring them. Bring back what the canyon refuses." We moved fast, because the only alternative was wrong. Pike rode with us without being asked. His boys rode because his horse did. Chayton and Daniel begged with their eyes. The old man shook his head once and gave them drums instead. Not every battle happens where men point their guns. The mine road switchbacked up a broken face of rock that had never promised to be kind. The wagon crawled like a spider with too much burden. 2 riders flanked faces rapt, eyes dull with obedience. The third sat the buckboard and snapped the reins, as if that were a way to move the earth. We didn't have time for a sermon. We needed a miracle or luck. Luck is just a miracle with its hat pulled low. At a hairpin where the drop would soften nothing, I slid off the saddle and worked around, stones shifting under my boots like rumors. Anya and Pike took the left. The boys found a vantage where men become arguments. When the wagon reached the tightest turn, I stood and yelled just to give them something to aim at. That wasn't the women. They obliged. Bullets chewed rock and whined off into stories. I fired once, took the driver in the shoulder. He dropped the reins. The horses panicked. The wagon lurched. Anya's rifle cracked. The left guard's hat flew, and with it, his nerve. Pike's shot was a question mark that found a period in the other man's chest. The wagon tipped. For a moment, time stretched like rawhide. Then gravity won its unbroken streak. The right wheel climbed the edge and went over. The tongue snapped. The horses bolted, dragging half a thought's worth of wood with them. The box slid sideways and kissed the rock too hard. It burst. 3 women tumbled out, hands tied, mouths gagged, eyes enormous. I was already moving. I landed hard enough to teach my knees humility, cut the first gag with my knife, then shoved her behind a boulder. The second and third came up fighting because good women do. I pointed them the right way. Bullets slapped the stone near my head. The driver found his feet and his pistol. He fired. My hat died a second death. Then a different sound drum. Fast, insistent, too near. I risked a glance back toward the ridge. Chayton stood there, Daniel beside him, both beating the same rhythm. 3 quick, 2 slow, 3 quick. Echo caught it and threw it back. The canyon became a heart. The driver hesitated. It doesn't take much to make a man notice he is in a holy place and making the wrong kind of noise. Anya didn't hesitate. Her shot took him under the clavicle. He sat down surprised and didn't get back up. Silence after is heavier than noise. It landed on us all at once. The women were shaking, but with effort, not just fear. One of them, dark hair torn free, cheeks raw, looked at me like I was the wrong savior and she would mention it in the sermon but thank me anyway. "Cut the rest," she said through a throat that had swallowed rope. "We can run. You can walk," Anya said, already at the knots. "No more running today." Red. When we reached the valley at dusk, the old man was waiting with blankets and broth and a prayer that sounded like water when it knows where it is going. The rescued women ate, cried, cursed, slept each in the order her life required. Pike's boys sat with their backs to a rock and stared at their hands as if the lines had changed while they were busy. Chayton and Daniel tried to look as if they hadn't disobeyed. The old man let them succeed. "Your drums were the wind," he told them. "Sometimes that is the only thing that moves men." Later, when most had found sleep and the stars were doing their old duty with new light, Anya and I walked to the shelf above the spring. The canyon mouth made a dark, careful shape against the sky. "You hear it?" she asked. I listened. At first, only wind. Then, as my ears stopped insisting on their own wisdom, something else, the faintest tail of the rhythm the boys had made, still bouncing in the stone's memory, a heartbeat that refused to quit. "Echo," I said. "Echo remembers," she said. "Like wind, like earth, like people when they try." I took the old man's pouch from my coat and set it on the rock between us. I opened it and breathed in what it offered. Then I said the thing the wind would carry whether I wanted it to or not. "I want to stay," I said. Anya didn't move. For a while I thought she hadn't heard. Then she sat and drew her knees up and wrapped her arms around them in a gesture so young it made the years inside her show all at once. "You will still go," she said. "Sometimes," I admitted. "There are ledgers left and bridges built wrong. The country is full of them, but I can ride back to a place the echoes know my name." "And the law?" "Doolin knows how to squint," I said. "He'll look aside when looking straight would break him." "And the men with papers?" "Paper burns," I said. "We taught it that." She laughed then, soft and dangerous. "You speak like a man with a plan." "I speak like a man with a home," I said, surprising myself with the word and how well it fit. She reached out, took my hand, turned it palm up. The bone disc she'd given me spiral within spiral lay on my skin. She traced it once, slow, like writing a word she wanted to read later. "Balance," she said. "Echo," I said. "Wind," she said. "Home," I said again, not for emphasis, but because the canyon needed to learn it. We sat until the stars grew tired of teaching us, and the cold argued for blankets. Back at the fire, Daniel had rolled in his sleep so that his hand touched Chaitin's drum. The old man snored like a mountain, deciding whether to shrug. Liza and Helen slept on either side of one of the rescued women, their breathing accidentally synchronized. Pike was awake and pretending not to be, watching the fire like it might tell him how to live without Viper's shadow. The next morning the canyon smelled of coffee and cedar and a kind of peace that doesn't brag because it knows how easily it's spooked. We set about mending what had cracked. Toys, fences, ties, men. Doolin came again and left with news and warnings and a sack of flour he pretended fell off a wagon. Work became the kind of rhythm even a hurt man can dance to. I taught Daniel to oil a rifle and forget why he wanted to use it. Anya taught me a song that kept stitches neat. Liza taught the children a way to read letters that made stories instead of laws. Helen taught the women a Boston recipe for bread that rose like good news if you were patient and kneaded without bitterness. When the moon rose fat and forgiving, the old man called us all to the circle where big decisions are made by small nods. He stood, he was silent, and his silence did the speaking. "This canyon keeps what is given in truth," he said. "We have been given names and fear and hope. We have given back water and fire and the sound of drums. The wind has been kind today. We will not squander it." He turned to me. "Ethan Grant," he said, "you are the lawman who is not. You are also the man who brings people through hollow places. You may stay, you may go. When you go, you carry us. When you stay, you are carried." End of T. I felt something I had not in a long time. Permission that didn't feel like a chain. After the circle broke, Anya and I walked the ridge. The desert was its old, indifferent self, which is the only honest thing a land can be. She took my hand without ceremony. "Tomorrow," she said, "we ride to the old mission, the one the storm remembered. There is a table there I wish to set right." "I'll bring tools," I said. "And coffee," she said. "And my foolish heart," I said, which made her laugh again and kiss me like the weather had turned fair. On the ride back to camp, the canyon threw our laughter around and returned it to us, changed bigger, older, truer. Echo does that to sound. Time does that to men if they let it. Night came without incident, no riders, no papers, no new names carved into old wood. The children dragged blankets into a knot under the cottonwoods. The women told a story into the dark, and the dark told it back with better timing. The old man snored his mountain song. Pike dreamed with his hat over his eyes. Doolin, somewhere, was trying not to get fired for keeping his humanity. I lay on my back and watched stars the way a man watches sheep when the wolves have agreed to take the night off. Anya's breath fell across my collarbone like the softest promise. "You awake?" she whispered. "Mostly." "What do you hear?" "Wind," I said. "Fire. Drums far away. Your heart." "And the echoes?" she asked. "They're saying what we said," I told her. "Home." In the morning we would mend the mission's table and plant beans in a soil that had decided not to betray us today. In a week we would ride north to warn a rancher that his hired gun brand was going to get his children taken if he kept taking signatures. In a month we would have to choose again whether the law was a knife or a rope or a hand to hold when the water is deep. In a year I didn't know. Men like me don't plan that far because the desert doesn't. But there, with the canyon of echoes breathing slow around us, and the wind carrying away promises it would one day bring back, I knew enough. The ghosts were quieter, the ledger was ash, the bridge was honest, and the woman beside me had refused to die. Morning bled slow again over Hozho Valley, the way it does when the world has been forgiven for one more day. And I, a man with dust in his pockets and a bad-shaped bruise on his heart, could count her pulse and call it prayer without lying. If you're watching on TV, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. The long ride home, the road west, never ends. It just forgets where it began. 3 days after leaving the canyon, I crossed the San Pedro River, more mud than water, glinting under a sky sharp as flint. The land out here has no patience for memory. It grinds everything down to silence and bone. But somehow, I carried her voice with me the way she'd said my name like a promise the wind was bound to keep. The horse limped a little from the long miles, My shoulder ached from the fight. I'd lost my hat somewhere between the ridge and the valley, but I didn't miss it. Some things aren't worth chasing once you've seen the sun bareheaded. By dusk, I reached a town I didn't know, small, half asleep, one street